Welcome to today. We have a little unique opportunity. We've been doing the Golden Moments and Memories, of course, as a part of the 1873 Speaker Series, sponsored by the University of North Georgia's Alumni Association in conjunction with the North Georgia College of Choral Cadets Association, the Women of North Georgia, and the Young Alumni. But we're going to take a little different approach than what we've been doing on previous segments. Today we're going to spend some time talking with a gentleman who has been associated with the university in one way or the other for 60 plus years. Somebody who has served both as a cadet and as part of the faculty and staff, and as well has also served the local community. So we are real happy today to have Colonel Retired Gerald Lord, class of 1961, from North Georgia, and we're going to just let him tell us a little bit about his experience coming to North Georgia, what it was like to be a cadet, maybe a little bit about his Army career, and we'll kind of go from there. But I'm just really excited. Gerald was a senior when I was a freshman. He was the Brigade XO when I was a freshman in A Company. So Gerald, welcome. We're glad to have you today, and why don't you just start us off, tell us a little bit about how you got to North Georgia.
Thanks, John. I'm excited to sit here and talk to you for a few minutes. I thought I'd talk a little bit about how I came to North Georgia. I grew up down in Gwinnett County on a sharecropper's farm, so it wasn't very much money in a sharecropper's farm in those days. We didn't have electricity in our house when I was first born. Didn't have indoor plumbing, so it was kind of a tough life, but a good life. We were poor, but we never had trouble with food because we grew most of our food. Right. I had a really mundane time as a young man growing up. I went to school in Grayson to start with, yeah. And the first day I rode the bus to the school, and at the end of the day I didn't know which bus to get on. And all of a sudden all the buses were gone, and I didn't have a ride home. So a teacher had to take me home that first day. But it got better as time went on. I attended Sunny Hill High School, very rural. Sunny Hill Grammar School, very rural grammar school. Then I went to Lawrenceville High School for graduation. I played sports in high school, and that's where I started learning how to be a leader and do the things that you have to do to get by in life. Right. When I graduated from high school, my dad said, I'd like to send you to college, but I can't. I just don't have the money. And he didn't have any. So I worked for a year before I came to college. Started working in a Georgia shoe factory in Flower Branch, $1 an hour. My boss watched me for a couple of weeks, and he came over and he said, "You're a real good worker." He said, I'm going to give you a raise. I was making $1 an hour. So I'm going to give you a raise. So I thought, well, he'd probably give me a 25-cent raise. He gave me a nickel. So I worked for the rest of that year for $1 and a nickel an hour. It was a good experience, but in fact, before I went to work there, I applied to Lockheed Aircraft Manufacturing Company. And I got through all the interviews and all the stuff, and finally the guy said, "How old are you?" I said, 17. He said, "We can't hire you at 17. I said, "Come back when you're 18. So I went back later on, and I worked for Lockheed for about 3 months. And at that point, they had a massive layoff. Of course, I'd been there over 3 months, so I got laid off. Sure. So I said, well, I worked for a year, so and I don't have a job, so I'll just go to college. So I applied to North Georgia and got accepted. And it was a downbeat to be laid off from your job, not have a job, but it was probably the best move that ever happened to me. Sure. So I came to North Georgia, My parents dropped me off in front of Sanford Hall, and Bill Chapman was about 6'3" tall. Was the first sergeant, and he after our parents left, things turned a little bit different.
Yeah.
He talked to us a little bit differently than he did when the parents were there. But he had us form up out in front of I knew absolutely nothing about the military. Never been around military people, never talked to anybody. I knew it was a military school, but I didn't know what that meant.
Sure.
Bill put us in formation and gave us a left face, and I heard that, and I kind of knew what to do. I didn't do it right, but I did turn left. Gave us a forward march, and I knew how to do that. He gave us to the rear march. I didn't understand what he said. If I had, I wouldn't have known what to do. So the whole company ran over me as I was trying to get turned around and go in the other direction. That was my introduction to the military. It was an opportunity, though, for me to grow and develop from a little country boy who had never been anywhere in his life. In fact, I remember I was, I guess, probably junior or senior in high school. My mother and brother and I were chopping cotton in the cotton field. We stopped for a little break. And I said, "Mom, I don't know what I'm going to do the rest of my life, but it's not going to be chopping cotton." So I finally got into college, and I was having too much fun to worry about academics. I didn't fail anything, but I didn't excel in anything either. That went on for 2 years, and PMS called me in at the end of my sophomore year. He said, "Son, do you want to go into the Army?" And I said, "Yeah, I sure do." He said, "You're not going to go in the Army if you don't start studying. If you don't get your grades up, you're not going in the Army." So I made the dean's list the next 2 quarters. Incentive. He spoke a language that I understood. But I had a wonderful time in college. Made some great friends that are still very close friends of mine now.
What was your major?
I started out as a physics and math major. And Professor Townsend, I was taking, I don't remember which math course it was, analytical geometry, I think. He said, "You're going to fail this course." I said, "No, I'm not." He said, "Yes, you are." And I worked really hard in that course, and I made a C. So I figured, well, it's time I changed my major. My real purpose for coming to North Georgia was I wanted to be a high school football coach.
Okay. So
my plan was to go in the Army, do my 3 years, and get out and be a high school coach. I never made a decision to stay in the Army for a career. It just happened. Every time I did another year, something else came up. I was a second lieutenant at Fort Benning, Georgia, and we were out on a field exercise. I had dug my foxhole. It was just pouring down rain. I was sitting on the edge of my foxhole. Water was up to almost to my ankles in the bottom of my foxhole, and I heard an airplane fly over. I said, "That guy is going to sleep between clean sheets tonight." So when I got out of the field, I applied for flight school. And went to flight school in 1963, and then spent the next 27 years in aviation. And in those days, we didn't have an aviation branch.
Right.
I was an infantry officer, so every other tour I'd serve in the infantry and then I'd serve in the aviation assignment.
Now, was this fixed wing or rotary, or what did you do?
I started in fixed wing and flew fixed wing for 2 or 3 years, and then went to transitioned into helicopters also.
Okay.
My first tour in Vietnam, I went as a fixed wing pilot and flying Mohawks.
Okay.
On surveillance in the Delta.
What rank were you at that point?
Captain. Well, I made major during that tour. Then I came back to the States and went to the advanced course. And 12 months later, I was back in Vietnam as a helicopter pilot.
Right.
And I flew with the 101st up in Icour, near the DMC. An unbelievable experience. It was the first time I've done what I trained to do in the Army. And we were flying combat assaults almost every day. And I would, if it was a platoon size operation, I let the platoon leader lead the formation. If it was bigger than a platoon, I was the flight lead. And so sometimes I'd be flight lead, sometimes I'd be the CNC ship overhead. But I always flew into LZ first.
Okay.
So the troops behind me didn't have to worry about, is the boss going to go in? So
Right.
We had some other companies that people wouldn't go into the LZ because they didn't like the way things were set
Sure.
up.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I had the maintenance officer give me the weakest helicopter we had. So I knew that if I could get in and get out, everybody behind me could get in and get out. And that worked pretty well.
And so you were part of the 101st at that point then?
Correct.
Oh.
And I started out in the 101st Aviation Battalion as a maintenance officer. And I flew, and I had never flown helicopters outside of flight school. So I was a rather new helicopter pilot. So I cut my teeth in the 101st Aviation Battalion. And then, kind of funny, the Charlie Company commander was rotating out, and they didn't have anybody else planned to take his place. So I went down to Charlie Company and started flying combat assault with them. And Chris Sinclair was the brigade commander, or group commander, aviation group commander. He saw us out on an LZ when they stopped in. He said, "What are you doing down here?" I said, "Well, I'm just flying some missions to learn how to fly." He said, Are you spending the night in Charlie Company?" I said, "Yes, sir." He got all upset. He said, "You get yourself back into the company and get out of that, you go back to battalion." So I went back to battalion and I told the battalion commander, I said, I'm in trouble. I don't know what happened. I don't know why he got so upset, but he is not happy. So with your permission, I'll go talk to him tonight and see if I can figure it out. He said, "Okay." So I went over and talked to Colonel St. Clair. He and I were stickmates going through the helicopter transition course. And when I went into country, he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to command a company." He said, "You don't have enough experience." And I didn't really, honestly. But I said, but Colonel, you and I went through flight school at the same time, and you're a brigade commander, or group commander. Why can't I be a company commander? So he sent me back to the battalion with no instructions. And next morning I got up and I had orders to go to the 158th Aviation Battalion up at Camp Evans,
Okay.
which is a sister battalion to the 101st. And I walked into the battalion. They said, "You're the Charlie Company commander." So I commanded Charlie Company, but it was in the 158th, it was in the 101st. And I spent 6 months doing that.
Okay.
They rotated us out on 6 months. I wanted to spend the rest of the time there until I rotated back, but they wouldn't let us.
Yeah. So when you came back, you rotated back, and what type of assignments did you have to finish out your 27 years?
I came back to the States and went to Fort Riley, Kansas, and commanded it was a correctional training facility. And we took people out of prison, Army prisons, we brought them in, and we spent a few months training them, retraining them on being soldiers.
Okay.
And that was a unique experience.
I bet.
The worst case I had, I guess, was the soldier who had killed his wife. And he was I don't know why he did it. Never did figure it out. But we had to retrain them and send them back out to the units.
So was infantry your basic branch?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Then I went to Leavenworth for Commandant General Staff, and that was a good experience for me to start to learn a little bit more about the senior levels of the Army. And at that point, we had to take elective courses, so I took history. I'd been a history major at one point, and then the Army called and said, I took 2 courses of master's degree history. The DA or Milperson called and said, would you like to go to Kansas State, which is providing the course,
Right.
finish your master's degree? I said, I sure would. He said, okay, you got 6 months. I said, I can't do it in 6 months. He said, we got 6 months.
Do it.
So I went to graduate school for 6 months and had everything done except my thesis. So I had to write that on my own after I finished.
Right.
And so I stayed there in Kansas for another 2 years and taught ROTC in the program. And then I went to Korea.
Mhm.
And Milperson called and said, I have bad news for you, you're going to Korea. And I said, it's not bad news because I need to get out of this job, I need to get back in the Army. And I said, can I take my wife? He said, no, this is an unaccompanied tour. And I said, no, I understand that, but can I, my own experience, can I just take my wife because we don't have any children, so it's not a problem. And he said, well, if you're that interested, I'll just give you an accompanied tour. So I went to Korea for 2 years with Kay.
Okay.
And it was a great experience for us because we loved moving around the world and interacting with different cultures. And the Koreans were a unique culture. I didn't particularly like the Vietnamese culture, but the Korean culture was very, very interesting.
Right. Now, was these assignments, were they more infantry oriented as opposed to aviation?
No, in Korea, all my assignments were aviation.
Aviation.
I started out as a maintenance officer at the group level, then moved in to be the XO of the group. George Newton was the commander, and one of the battalion commanders was rotating back to the States, and his replacement was coming from Fort Lewis, Washington. Unfortunately, he falsified some records on his flight records to show he'd been flying more than he'd been flying, and they caught him and wouldn't let him take command of the battalion. The group commander said, what are we going to do? I said, I just made Lieutenant Colonel just a few days before. I said, Coach, send me.
That's right.
He said, well, what's your wife going to say? She's going to say goodbye. So I went down to Pyeongtaek, I guess it was, and commanded the battalion for about 3 months. And Kay would come down. We had a big German Shepherd and a Volkswagen Beetle car, and she'd drive that Beetle to where I was stationed and spend the weekend with me, and that worked out okay. Had a chance to get involved in some really delicate situations. One of the Chinooks in my battalion went across the border into North Korea.
Ooh.
and was captured. And
Was this accidental, or did they, or who knows?
they accidentally went in.
Okay.
Didn't navigate close enough, I guess. And so we had to negotiate the release of the people. And that was not a fun operation. It was very, very sensitive.
Yeah.
Then after Korea, I came back to the States. And I'd been picked up to command a battalion. So I went to Fort Bragg with about 3 months before the battalion was going to open up. And when I got to Bragg, I talked to the G1, and as a major, he said, I can't tell you what your assignment's going to be, so let's go talk to the Lieutenant Colonel. It's okay. So we talked to the Lieutenant Colonel. He said, well, let's go talk to the Colonel. And finally said, let's go talk to the Chief of Staff of the 18th Airborne Corps.
Wow.
So then I knew I was in trouble. I didn't know what it was going to be. I went in and he said, we talked a few minutes about other things. He said, what do you know about a fire department? And I thought it was just more small talk. I said, I don't know anything about a fire department. He said, good. He said, you're going to be the fire chief of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, until we can find somebody else to do it. They had fired the fire chief because of stealing. And fired the fire chief and the 2 assistants.
Aren't those normally civilian jobs?
They are, but they didn't have a civilian to take the job.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So I became the fire marshal of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and that was an experience,
I bet.
real experience. Then I took the battalion, air traffic control battalion, at Fort Bragg. And that was really a signal branch assignment.
Yeah.
But they let me in anyway. And we had just had a great time. So we supported every tactical operation in the States, and really anybody in CONUS. So we went to Panama, we went to Fort Irwin for operations, went to Florida. So we were gone most of the time, and that's when Kay really blossomed as a battalion commander's wife. She had to take care of all those women who many of them didn't know the first thing about the Army.
Right.
She taught a couple of them how to drive. She taught them how to shop. One woman didn't know how to write checks, so she had to teach her how to balance her checkbook. That was a great learning experience for her. She did a great job.
Well, let's interrupt just a minute. You mentioned your wife a couple of times, and I remember Kay, obviously, and she and my wife were both cheerleaders, varsity cheerleaders for the basketball team.
Yeah.
But tell us a little bit more about her and how y'all became a couple, and then we're going to go back. I'm not going to let you off the hook on some of this other stuff.
Okay. Well, Kay was from Marietta and dated one of my best friends, and I was engaged at the time to another girl, lady. But Kay and I were friends. Kay played bridge every minute she could between classes. So
In those days, as I recall, there was a continuing bridge game in the canteen, and
there was.
if you had to go to class, you handed your hand to somebody else, and then when you came back an hour later, they'd hand it back to you.
Sure did.
Yep, okay.
And those were some great days.
Yeah.
Kay and I were just good friends. Never had a date. I'd been in the Army a couple of years, and a good friend of mine, I was roommates with, broke up with his girlfriend in Washington, D.C. She was in Milperson. And he said, I need to write somebody. I said, I don't know anything to write. He said, tell me somebody I can just write. I just need somebody to pen pal. So I said, well, write Kay Norton. So he wrote Kay. And Kay invited him up to Marietta for the weekend. And she said, bring Gerald and I'll get him a date. Well, we got to Marietta and she didn't have the date for me. So I spent the night in a motel while Bud and Kay went out on the town. And after that event, we dated a couple of times. And in fact, I think we went to the Sweetheart Ball that year together. And we got married in March the 1st of 1964.
Okay.
And we had a year and a half honeymoon in Germany at the Army's expense.
So you've been, what, 7.5 years or so?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And she hasn't thrown me out yet.
Sweet lady.
Yeah.
So back to your story here. You were from Fort Bragg. At some point, you came back to North Georgia. I'm not sure whether it was another interim spot there, because I remember something about Fort McPherson. But
yeah.
Bring us back to speed on that.
Well, I after commanding the battalion, I went to the Pentagon, and I went down to my assignment, and it said, here's your area. And there was no desk, no chair or anything. I said, where do I get a desk? He said, just walk down the hall until you find one and bring it in. So I did that. I found a desk. And spent about two and a half years in the Pentagon. And Kay and I had not wanted children when we got married for a couple of years. Then in those 2 years, we started trying to have children, and never could. And when we went from Fort Bragg to Washington to really Northern Virginia, we went up to look at houses. And I told the real estate agent, I said, I need a house, but it has to be under $100,000. This was in 1981. He said, I can't show you anything less than $100,000. I said, well, I can't afford more. He said, well, I'll show you some. So he showed me some, and the houses were okay, but the neighborhoods were just terrible.
Sure.
So we found a house that Kay just dearly loved, a little split level in Alexandria, Virginia. It was was $150,000. I said, I can't afford this much of a house now. She said, if I go to work, she went back to graduate school, went back to college in Kansas to get a degree in teaching. Then she went to graduate school in North Carolina to get a master's degree. So she had not been working. She said, if I go to work, can we afford this house? I said, yeah, if you go to work, we can afford this house.
Right.
So she went out and got a job. About 3 months later, she came up pregnant. I said, can you do anything to get out of work?
Good news and bad news.
Yeah. So we struggled to pay the house note every month because we just weren't prepared to do that.
Right.
She worked up until the baby was born. Then through mutual agreement, we decided she wouldn't go back to work. She'd raise that little boy.
Yeah.
And he's turned out to be a wonderful young man.
Good.
And we stayed there for 2.5 years, and then we went to War College. And in all the schools I've been in before, advanced course, managerial staff, I always wanted to be on the commandant's list, at least the commandant's list. And when I went to the War College, I said, I'm not going to worry about how I finish in this class, I'm just going to enjoy it. And I did just as well as I would have. I've been anxious. But then I left the War College. In fact, John Owen was president of North Georgia when I was in the Pentagon. And he came to Northern Virginia for an alumni event. And Vern Smith was assigned to the ROTC department here on campus. And Dr. Owen really liked Vern. Vern called me and said, would you like to be the PMS? I said, no, I don't think I want to do that. And went home and told Kay, I said, guess what happened today? And she said, well, that'd be fun. So we talked about it for a while and finally decided. So I called Vern the next day. I said, Vern, I'd like to be interviewed for you. He said, okay. So Dr. Owen's coming to Virginia. you go to the event and talk to him there. It's okay. So we went to the event, and Dr. Owen, of course, was talking to everybody. And I didn't get a chance to really talk to him. He was gone. So I called Vern the next Monday, and I said, Vern, I didn't get a chance to really talk to Dr. I talked to him a few minutes, but didn't really get a chance to interview. I said, I can fly down and interview for the job if you can set it up. He said, no, you're already hired. So Dr. Owen got all he wanted from me. So I came from the War College to North Georgia, and I was concerned. I knew there had been some change. I had not been back on campus except one time I drove through.
Right.
I knew there had been some changes. I didn't know how I was going to react to those. I looked at what the changes were, and they all made sense. You could wear civilian clothes after 5 o'clock, which you do that if you're in the Army.
In the Army, sure.
So I didn't have any problem adjusting to the changes. It was one of the hardest jobs I've ever had, but also one of the most enjoyable. I felt so good because I knew that I was influencing the Army for the next 20 or 30 years by teaching these young students how to be officers.
Right.
And the class that I started with as a freshman in '84, when they graduated, it was a good class.
Yeah.
Five of those senior members made brigadier general at least.
I've
Most
heard
of them made major general.
You're right.
And so that really made me feel good that I had done the things I should have been doing all along.
Sure, sure.
Then I got a call. Ed Seals, class of '60, called me and said, you're getting ready to leave. Let me back up a second. It was a 3-year tour at North Georgia for the Army.
Right.
And in those days, the Commandant and the PMS was the same person.
Okay.
Dr. Owen had set that up. So he called me up at the end of my 3 years. He said, I want you to stay another year. I said, I'd be glad to, Dr. Owen, but the Army won't let me. He said, okay. He picked up the phone, he called Washington. He said, you're going to stay another year. John Owen didn't waste any time
He
getting
did
things
not.
done.
He was quite a dynamo, and,
He was.
and has still has his presence on this campus in so many different ways.
Sure does. But, so after this tour though, Ed Seals called and said, how would you like to be the garrison commander at Fort McPherson? And again, I said, no, I don't want to do that. I talked to Kay in case she convinced me I should. And so our last 3 years in the Army was at Fort McPherson. That was an unbelievable assignment.
Right.
We were changing commanders of Force Com. General Byrd was leaving, and General Plaster was leaving, and General Powell was coming in.
Colin Powell.
Yeah.
I remember him being there.
The field, parade field was right across the street from the Four Stars house. We were getting everything finalized, ready to go. They were having coffee at the general's house. And all of a sudden a squirrel got into our electrical system and blew the power all on the whole post. So I went over and I said, General Plaster, have another cup of coffee because it's going to be about 30 minutes before we start this parade. So that.
Well, let me ask you this. I've often wondered, because I've known of other colonels who've been the post commander, but with all those generals around, how did that work?
I had absolutely no problem with the generals.
Because there were several, weren't there? I think.
22, I think.
Oh wow.
We spoke the same language. Now that's not the same for wives. Every wife wanted what the general's wife had. So one would say, now I need an arbor for some grapevines that I'm going to plant here. So you had to walk a thin line. General Pilastra was commander when I first got there. One of the most disciplined generals I've ever known in my life. He did everything by the book. His wife was totally opposite. She loved to prune bushes and trees and all the things. So the engineer called me one day. He said, Mrs. Pilastra is out cutting shrubs on South Road. Said, you got to get her out of there. I said, no. Get a truck and one man and put them behind her. When she cuts a limb, you put that limb in that truck. And but she was a unique lady.
Yeah, well, I bet it was a unique experience to be
It was.
in downtown Atlanta, basically, and the 22 generals, and everybody wanting their share of whatever.
That's right.
Well, back to the progression after Fort Mac, and you retired. Is that when you came back to Dahlonega?
Well, no, I did eventually, yes. But when I was getting ready to retire, I got a call from a person I didn't know. Owned a bunch of parking decks out at the airport, and he was not pleased with how they were operating. He said, I want you to go out and tell me how to make this work. But I said, I don't know anything about parking lots. He said, no, but you've had a lot of leadership experience, so I want you to do this.
Right.
He said, I'll pay you, I don't remember what it was. He gave me how much he'd pay me to do it. I said, okay. So that's when I bought my first computer.
Oh.
I didn't have a computer, personal. So I bought one so I could type up this report. And so I went out and looked around for a couple of days and didn't tell anybody who I was or what I was doing. Finally I went in and talked to the leadership there and kind of scoped out what they wanted. I wrote a report, sent it to him. He said, this is exactly what I want. Now I want to hire you to make this work.
Yeah.
I said, no, I don't want to do that. I said, that's not what I've always wanted to do. He said, well, at least try it out. I said, okay. So I became the parking czar at Atlanta Airport for a while. It was not a fun job.
Yeah, I bet.
Had very limited opportunities. So one morning it took me 20 minutes to get from the top of the on-ramp at Gwinnett Mall to the bottom of the on-ramp. 20 minutes just on the ramp. And I told Kay at breakfast the next morning, I said, I'm going to quit this job. She said, when? I said, today. So I went in and wrote my letter of resignation. I stayed another month or so to give him time to find somebody to replace me.
Right.
Then I started networking to get another job. Dr. Owen called me and he said, send me your resume. I said, okay. I said, what job you looking at, sir? And he said, just send me your resume. So I sent him my resume, and they called me for the interview for the job of auxiliary services. So I interviewed, and Bill Gertzbacher hired me.
Right.
And I worked that for a while, 3 or 4 years. And but at that point, the Army was having trouble with VMI and the Citadel and women.
Right.
But both schools said, we're not gonna let women in the Corps. In all the schools, the PMS was the Commandant of Cadets also. As a Commandant, you work for the university. As a PMS, you work for the Army.
Right.
And we didn't have a problem here on campus because we let women in as soon as they could.
Yeah.
But it became evident Citadel and VMI were not going to fall into line. So DA said, you got to split the Commandant and the PMS. School, you can hire your own Commandant, but you can't be, PMS cannot be your Commandant. But they made an exception. They said you can let the person that's in the job do it now until he retires or leaves. And Ed Chamberlain was PMS and Commandant. And by that time, Dr. Sherm Day had taken over as president of the university. And he called me and he said, I'm going to go ahead and split PMS and Commandant now, but I don't have the money to hire a Commandant. He said, I want you to be the Commandant. I said, Dr. Day, I don't want to do that. I've done that before, and it's just not something I want to do again. So he said, okay. So about 2 weeks later, he called me back and he said, I still want you to be the Commandant. I said, I'll do whatever you tell me, Dr. Day, but I don't want to do that. And about 3 weeks later, he called me up and he said, you're going to be the Commandant. I told him, I said, I like being the auxiliary director. It gives me a chance to do things I always wanted to do. So about 3 weeks later, he called me up and he said, you're going to be the Commandant. You can keep your old job as auxiliary services director too.
Wear 2 hats.
2 hats. So I would go to the Commandant's office in the morning and auxiliary services in the afternoon. Tough 2 years. I did it for 2 years.
And just briefly explain to folks that may not be familiar with that term, what did auxiliary services include?
Auxiliary services includes the operating things that make money for the university, like the dining hall. We had a contract with Aramark to do the dining services, but we made a profit on it. We had rental vehicles, the dormitories. I maintained the dormitories. I maintained I oversaw the food service, and those are the main things.
Yeah.
And it was a real fun job because it was doing things kind of like what I did as Garrison Commander at Fort McPherson. And I enjoyed it. I got involved with buying property for the university and that kind of thing. And so I did that for the 2 years, and finally they hired Tom Palmer to be the Commandant. He did it for 20 years. He did a super job.
Sure.
And then I got promoted to be the Associate VP for Business and Finance. And I got more involved in purchasing property, and I oversaw the construction of the parking deck in the rec center, and a few other things like that.
Right.
Kept me busy, and it was things I enjoyed doing.
Sure.
So I told Mac McConnell, I said, I'm going to retire in 2000, I think it's 2005. He said, okay. So I scheduled a vacation to Australia, New Zealand, and Fiji.
Okay.
And a month. We're going to be gone a month. And Mac called me and said, you can't retire. I said, well, I got $15,000 invested in this trip. He said, well, you can go for a month, but when you come back, you're going to be staying on for another while, till we get somebody else. So I spent 3 more years working here.
As I recall it, and you got pulled back one other time to be what, the interim director of the Alumni Association or something at one point?
Well, yeah, for a short time, it's 6 or 8 months.
Yeah.
Vern Smith and Mark Howarth have been the foundation and the Alumni Association for a number of years.
Right.
And Vern was still the foundation director, and Mark was taking care of alumni, and Mark left. And the vice president they worked for called me and said, can you fill in as the interim alumni director? I said, yeah. I said, when do you want me to start? He said, today. So I did about 6 months.
Right.
And I was not seeking a job, it was just to fill in.
Well, before we finish up, I've always had this question. You actually had association with a number of presidents over the years. You were probably, what, 5 or so different presidents? I don't know.
I never counted them up, but it was John Owen, Delmas Allen, Nat Hansford, Sherman Day, Potter, and I did not work for Dr. Jacobs.
Okay, but when you were a student here, it was our president was General Merritt Hogue.
Sure was.
So you had some interaction
Sure
there.
was.
Is
Sure was.
Yeah.
Well, President Hogue, his wife passed away. I'm trying to remember how this works.
While you're thinking of that, just so folks may not know, we're sitting in the Alumni House, and the Alumni House actually was the president's home back in those days.
Absolutely.
And I remember as a freshman, we had a command performance. We had to put on our Class A uniforms and come in the front door and
Yep.
Shake President and Mrs. Hogue's hand.
Yep.
Went back and had some cookies and punch and went out the back door.
That's right, sure did.
Yeah.
Was
But this is the house we're sitting in today.
It
It's now
is.
the Alumni House.
Dr. Owen was a unique guy. I just loved him. He was a great guy, great leader, great president. But he did nothing slow. He did everything at 100 miles an hour. A couple of times, the garage is in the basement of this house. He would get in his car in the morning and back up. And a couple of mornings he didn't raise the garage door. So they made a big sign and hung down right in front of the window that says, "Raise the door." But I really, all but one of those people that I worked for as president were outstanding people, great leaders, great foresight, great planners for the university. I often thought, which one did I like the most? And I really can't tell you because they were all just wonderful leaders.
We have just been so blessed with presidents, particularly over the last 25 years or so. It's just, it's amazing.
Every one of them had their unique characteristics.
And Dr. Jacobs has carried on that tradition.
Absolutely. But Nat Hansford could tell you how many steps it was from his parking spot to his office. Not many people count the steps.
Right.
But they were, and of course, all of their wives were outstanding
Sure.
first ladies.
Yeah.
Did a great job for us.
Gerald, we really appreciate everything you have done over the years for North Georgia, and it's just wonderful to hear you talk about these. I'm gonna feel like I need to go buy you a cup of coffee and take another hour and listen to more stories, and maybe we'll have you come back. But as we wrap up, is anything you'd like to say before we sign off today?
I should have stated up front. I'd probably still be in that cotton field down in Gwinnett County if I had not come to North Georgia. They introduced me to a life that I had not known before. It was a great education. It was a great training ground for a young man who wanted to succeed in life. And it was not painful. I mean, they taught you things that you needed to know. I probably had a mediocre career, but it would have been nothing compared to what I would have had if I had not come to school here.
Right.
And it started with that first morning, first afternoon really, of telling me to left face and rear march, and I can't thank them enough. In fact, one story I meant to tell you, it slipped my mind. In my junior year, I finished 2 quarters of my junior year, and we're on quarter system then.
Right.
The 3rd quarter, I ran out of money. I'd saved money to go to college, but I ran out of money. So I went to see Dean Young. I said, Dean, I'm going to drop out of school for a year, but I want you to accept me when I come back, because I'll be back. And he said, no. If you leave, you'll never come back. I said, no, I will. I worked for a year before I came, and I've run out of money. I don't have any money, so I've got to go earn some more money. He said, you go see Mr. Gilbert. He was a rough old guy anyway. So Mr. Gilbert was a comptroller. So I walked down the hallway to his office, and when I opened the door to go in, he said, how much money do you want?
Wow.
So he loaned me enough money to finish that quarter.
Wow.
He said, he said, what are you going to do for next year? I said, I don't know, because I'm going to summer camp, so I won't make any money this summer. He said, well, you come see me when you come back next year. They loaned me, at the end of when I graduated, I owed the federal government $1,100. Of course, that doesn't sound like much money today, but it was a lot of money then. And I thought, how in the world am I ever going to pay this back?
Right.
So I started paying as much as I could pay every month until I paid it off. And at that point, I was probably in Kansas State University. And I said, well, I need to repay North Georgia College. So I made a $100 donation to the foundation that year. And the next year, and then eventually I got up to 150. And over the years, it's kind of climbed. But I think I don't know how many years continuously I've donated, but 20-something years.
Well, the $1,100, just so to help put it in perspective for folks, I remember that as a freshman, and you mentioned the quarter system, it was basically $330 a quarter, and that was room and board and the whole bit. So it basically cost $1,000 in those days to go to school.
Yeah.
And so the $1,100, I mean, that's the equivalent of a full year's tuition.
Sure is.
But it further illustrates the need that all alumni need to support all of the various scholarships that we've got. There's so many of them that are worthwhile scholarships. Some of them by the class, Eagle funds, different things. And I would just encourage all alumni to help with the scholarships, because there are plenty of people just like Gerald, even in today, even though they may not have come from the cotton field, they still need some help.
Yeah.
Gerald, again, we just appreciate so much you being a part of the 1873 Speaker Series, and we hope that maybe we can get you to come back and chat with us again at a future time, and make sure you give our best to Miss Kay.
I sure will.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.